Welcome to Mr. Hutchings' History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Hey everyone, welcome back. I think we all agree that we try to keep things relatively light here, but today we're going to dive into something pretty heavy.
Definitely a dark chapter.
Yeah, but it's one of those things that, we can't just shy away from, right? You've got to face these hard truths head on.
Absolutely. I think understanding these darker moments is crucial if we want to learn from the past.
Totally agree. And, it's something that a lot of people might not even know much about. I mean, have you heard of Operation Condor?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think gets kind of buried under the weight of the Cold War narrative.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember that, while the Cold War was this global ideological battle, its impact was devastatingly real in places like Chile.
Yeah, for sure. Chile under Pinochet is a prime example of how these Cold War tensions played out in really brutal ways.
Yeah, so Pinochet, he was the general.
Right. General Augusto Pinochet.
Yeah.
He came to power in 1973.
Okay, so right in the thick of the Cold War.
Exactly. And it was through a coup, a military coup, that overthrew the democratically elected president Salvador Allende.
Allende, he was a Marxist, right?
He was. He was Chile's first Marxist president, democratically elected, which really rattled the U.S. at the time.
Yeah, I can imagine. So Pinochet basically used that fear of communism to his advantage.
Oh, absolutely. He was a master at exploiting those Cold War anxieties. He presented himself as the only one who could save Chile from becoming, as he put it, another Cuba.
Another Cuba. Wow. That must have really struck a chord at the time.
It did. You have to remember, this was the height of the Cold War. The U.S. was terrified of communist expansion, and Pinochet preyed on that fear brilliantly. He basically framed any opposition to him as a communist threat, which allowed him to justify his incredibly brutal crackdown on dissent.
So wait, so he was basically using this global fear of communism to solidify his own power.
Exactly. And he was very clever about it. He intentionally framed his regime as a key battleground in this global fight against communism, which drew in international actors.
And that's where the U.S. comes in, right? Nixon and Kissinger, they were running things at the time, and they were pretty obsessed with stopping the spread of communism.
Yeah, they were. And they saw Allende's socialist policies in Chile as a direct threat to their interests in the region. They were worried that if Chile fell to communism, other countries in South America might follow.
The domino effect. I've heard that term before.
Right. It was a huge fear during the Cold War. So the U.S., they were not at all happy about Allende's victory. And they weren't just passively observing the situation either.
Right. They were actively involved.
Yes. We now know from declassified documents that the U.S. was engaged in covert operations aimed at destabilizing Allende's government.
So actual secret missions to undermine him.
Exactly. One of these operations was called Project FUBELT.
Project FUBELT. What was that all about?
It involved propaganda campaigns, economic sabotage, really anything they could do to weaken Allende and create the conditions for a coup. They even considered kidnapping the head of the Chilean army to further sow chaos.
Wow. So they were playing pretty dirty.
Yeah, they were. They poured millions of dollars into these efforts, all to prevent what they saw as the communist threat in Chile.
So they weren't directly involved in the coup itself, but they were laying the groundwork.
That's the unsettling truth. They created an environment where a coup became almost inevitable.
And then Pinochet steps in, and, well, things get really dark.
Yeah, Pinochet's regime was incredibly brutal. It was marked by widespread human rights abuses, imprisonment, torture, executions. It's a really dark chapter in Chilean history.
And this is where Operation Condor comes in, right? It wasn't just limited to Chile. This was like a whole network of dictatorships.
Exactly. It spanned across borders, encompassing Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay. They were all working together to eliminate what they called subversives, which basically meant anyone with left-leaning political views.
Because we're talking about state-sponsored terrorism on an international scale.
It was terrifying. They used horrifying tactics, kidnappings, torture, executions without trial, and a practice that became synonymous with this era, forced disappearances. Thousands of people simply vanished.
Just gone.
Gone. And their families were left with this agonizing uncertainty, not knowing what happened to their loved ones. And remember, this wasn't just in Chile. People were abducted from other countries and disappeared as part of Condor's cross-border operations.
Wow. So the U.S., they were involved in this wider network too, right?
Yeah.
Not just with Pinochet in Chile.
Unfortunately, yes. Declassified documents have revealed the CIA's direct involvement in Operation Condor. They provided intelligence and operational support to these regimes. They even trained some key figures at the School of the Americas.
So while they were fighting the Cold War with the Soviet Union, they were also enabling these brutal regimes in South America.
It's a complex and morally ambiguous picture for sure. It raises serious questions about the human cost of Cold War ideology and the lengths to which the U.S. was willing to go to contain communism.
So Pinochet, he was consolidating his power, crushing dissent, and what was life actually like for everyday people in Chile? I mean, what was it like to live under his regime?
Imagine living in a society stripped of basic freedoms. Pinochet shut down all opposition, abolished Congress, imposed strict censorship. People lived in constant fear. You never knew if something you said or did, even the most innocent thing, might make you a target.
So basically a full-blown dictatorship.
Absolutely. And it was brutal. There were so many horrific incidents, but one that really stands out is the Caravan of Death. In the weeks after the coup, Pinochet's forces traveled the country executing political prisoners.
Oh my God.
It was systematic and ruthless, and this wasn't just limited to Chileans. Remember, Operation Condor meant that people from other countries were targeted too.
It's hard to even imagine living under that kind of fear.
Yeah.
But I read that Pinochet actually tried to justify all of this. Like he claimed that he was doing it for the good of Chile. How did he spin that?
He was very good at manipulating the narrative. He portrayed himself as the savior of Chile, rescuing the country from the clutches of Marxism. He argued that his brutal methods were a necessary evil, a harsh but essential response to prevent Chile from becoming another Cuba.
So he used the fear of communism to seize power and then to justify his reign of terror.
Precisely. He played on those Cold War anxieties, both domestically and internationally, to legitimize his actions. It's a chilling example of how fear can be used to serve political ends, even the most brutal ones.
It's crazy how he was able to twist things like that. And wasn't there also an economic element to his justification? I read something about some radical reforms he implemented.
Yeah, he brought in a group of economists known as the Chicago Boys. They were big believers in free markets and minimal government intervention.
So kind of like a shock to the system.
Exactly. It was called shock therapy. They rapidly privatized industries, deregulated markets, opened up the country to foreign investment.
So while he was brutally repressing dissent, he was also dramatically reshaping Chile's economy.
Yes. And that's created a lot of debate about his legacy. Some argue that while his methods were horrific, he did modernize Chile's economy and bring about stability. Others say that economic success can never justify the human cost.
It's a really tough question, and I bet historians have a lot to say about it.
Oh, absolutely. There are various schools of thought on this period, each offering a different perspective on Pinochet's rule and the role the U.S. played in supporting him.
Yeah, so, you've got these traditional Cold War historians, and they tend to see U.S. intervention in Chile as well. A necessary evil, I guess you could say.
A necessary evil.
Yeah, they view Pinochet, despite his brutality, as a staunch ally in the fight against communism.
So they're basically saying the ends justified the means, that stopping communism was more important than, human rights and democracy.
Yeah, it's a pretty simplified way to put it, but I think that's the gist of their argument. They're looking at it through the lens of the Cold War, this global struggle against communism. Right, they probably saw it as like a domino effect kind of thing.
Yeah.
Right, if Chile falls to communism, then who's next?
Exactly. And they would argue that the potential consequences of a communist takeover outweighed the human rights abuses committed by Pinochet.
I can see how that perspective, made sense at the time, given the fear surrounding communism. But it's still hard to swallow, considering the suffering of the Chilean people.
Yeah, and that's where the revisionist historians come in. They have a very different take on things.
Right.
Yeah, they're much more critical of the U.S.'s role. They argue that the U.S. actually destabilized Chile and made the situation worse by supporting these dictatorships.
Oh, they're saying the U.S. made things worse, not better.
Right. They believe that U.S. intervention actually undermined democracy in Chile and paved the way for Pinochet's authoritarian rule.
So it's like they're flipping the script on the traditional Cold War narrative.
Exactly. They're saying, hey, the U.S. was supposed to be promoting democracy, but they ended up supporting a dictator who crushed dissent and violated human rights.
It's amazing how these two perspectives completely change the story.
It is. And it shows that history is rarely black and white. There's always more than one way to interpret events.
So we have the traditionalists defending U.S. actions, the revisionists condemning them. Are there any other viewpoints on this?
Yeah, there's another perspective called post-revisionism. It tries to find some middle ground between those two views.
Okay, so like a compromise between the two extremes.
Sort of. They acknowledge that the U.S. had legitimate concerns about communism, but they also criticize the way the U.S. responded. The methods they used.
So they're saying like, okay, the U.S. was worried about communism, but they overreacted and made some bad decisions.
Exactly. They argue that the U.S. got caught up in this Cold War mentality and ended up making moral compromises.
Like supporting Pinochet even though he was a brutal dictator.
Right. And they'd say that while the U.S. may not have directly intended for those atrocities to happen, their actions created the conditions that made them possible.
It's really interesting how these different historical lenses can change our understanding of the past. It shows that there's not always one right answer.
Right. History is always open to interpretation and reinterpretation.
Is there one more perspective we should cover before moving on?
Yeah, we should definitely talk about the human rights historians.
Right. What's their take on this?
Well, they kind of shift the focus away from the big picture, the Cold War geopolitics. They're more interested in the individual stories, the people who suffered under these regimes.
So they're saying that regardless of the Cold War or Pinochet's economic reforms, the human rights violations were just wrong, and we can't ignore that.
Exactly. They want to remind us that behind all the political maneuvering, there were real people whose lives were destroyed. They emphasize the importance of holding people accountable for these atrocities.
So for them, it's about justice for the victims.
Right. They argue that we can't just sweep these things under the rug. We have to confront them and learn from them.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. It's important to remember that history is not just about abstract ideas. It's about real people and their lives.
Exactly. And the human cost of these events can't be ignored.
Well, that's a powerful reminder. So I guess now the question is, what kind of lasting impact did Pinochet's regime and Operation Condor have on Chile and the region? How do people remember these events today? And I guess most importantly, what can we learn from all of this?
Yeah, I think those are all really important questions, especially as we see, authoritarianism and threats to democracy popping up around the world today. I mean, the scars from Pinochet's regime, they run deep, even though Chile transitioned back to democracy in 1990.
It's been a pretty heavy conversation unpacking all of this. What would you say is the most important takeaway for our listeners as they try to make sense of Operation Condor?
I think the most crucial point to grasp is that while the Cold War was this global chess match between superpowers, its impact on places like Chile was devastatingly real. We can't lose sight of the human stories, the individual lives that were shattered by these events. For those who lived through it, it wasn't about abstract ideologies. It was about survival fear and the loss of loved ones.
That's so powerful.
Mm.
It's a stark reminder that history isn't just dates and names in a textbook. It's about real people and the choices made for better or worse by individuals, by governments. And those choices have consequences that can ripple through generations. It makes you question, what would I have done if I were living in Chile during those times?
Exactly. And by delving into these complex historical events, by grappling with their moral ambiguities, we can hopefully learn from the mistakes of the past and work towards a future where such atrocities never happen again.
We can only hope. As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm left thinking about something we touched on earlier, Pinochet's attempts to justify his actions. He claimed to be saving Chile from communism, and there's no denying that there was economic progress under his rule. But can we ever truly justify the horrific human cost? The disappearances, the torture, the crushing of dissent in the name of progress or ideology? Can economic success ever truly erase the stain of state-sponsored terror?
That's the question that continues to haunt this period of history, isn't it? It forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that progress, even economic advancement, can sometimes come at a terrible price. It challenges us to really think about what true accountability looks like. How do we hold individuals who commit such atrocities accountable? And how do we reckon with the role of nations that support such regimes even indirectly? Can a nation, a society truly move forward without a full reckoning with the ghosts of its past? These are questions that each of us, I think, has to wrestle with.
It's not easy, that's for sure. It's easy to condemn the horrors of the past from the comfort of the present, but the real challenge lies in ensuring that those mistakes are never repeated. It's a responsibility we all share.
I think you've hit on a crucial point. Remembering, understanding, and learning from history, even its darkest chapters, is not just an intellectual exercise. It's a moral imperative. It's about recognizing the warning signs, challenging those in power, and actively defending democratic values and human rights. Those lessons from Operation Condor, as unsettling as they are, hold a powerful message for us today, reminding us that the fight for justice and human dignity is an ongoing one.
Well said. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today exploring a truly dark and complex chapter of history. But sometimes confronting these difficult truths, these shadows of the past, is the only way to learn from them and work towards a better future. So to our listeners, keep those questions swirling, keep the conversation going, and keep striving for a world where the horrors of Operation Condor are never repeated. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring the...
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings' History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.